The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Sarah Martinez adjusted her combat boots for the third time. She had dreamed of this moment since she was 12 years old, watching her grandfather polish his old Army medals at the kitchen table. Now, at 22, she stood among 50 other recruits, ready to begin her journey in the United States Army. Sarah came from a small town in Texas where everyone knew everyone else's business. Her father worked at the local hardware store and her mother taught elementary school. They had raised her to believe that service to others was the highest calling, but they never imagined their daughter would choose military service. When Sarah announced her decision to enlist, her mother cried for 3 days straight. Her father said nothing for a week, then quietly began researching everything he could about military life. The drill sergeant's voice cut through the morning air like a knife. Sergeant Williams was a 20-year veteran with scars on his hands and stories that could fill a library. He looked at each recruit as if he could see right through to their soul. When his eyes met Sarah's, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready for whatever came next. Basic training pushed Sarah beyond limits she didn't know she had. While other recruits complained about the early morning runs and endless push-ups, Sarah found herself energized by the challenge. She helped struggling teammates, shared her rations when others forgot theirs, and never complained about the conditions. Her bunk was always inspection ready, her weapons always clean, and her attitude always positive. During week 6 of training, something happened that would change the course of Sarah's military career. The recruits were participating in a live-fire exercise when Private Johnson, a quiet young man from Ohio, froze in the middle of the course. Enemy simulation rounds were flying overhead, and Johnson crouched behind a barrier, unable to move forward or backward. The exercise was designed to test their ability to think under pressure, but Johnson was experiencing his first real panic attack. Sarah saw what was happening from her position 30 yards away. Without hesitation, she broke from her assigned route and low-crawled toward Johnson's position. Bullets whizzed overhead as she reached him, finding him shaking and hyperventilating behind the concrete barrier. She grabbed his face with both hands and looked directly into his eyes. "Johnson, look at me," she said firmly but gently. "You're going to be okay. We're going to get through this together." She helped him control his breathing, reminded him of his training, and together they completed the course. The instructors watched this unfold through their scopes, taking careful notes about the young woman who had risked her own score to help a fellow soldier. After the exercise, Sergeant Williams pulled Sarah aside. "Martinez," he said, "that was either the stupidest thing I've ever seen or the smartest. Time will tell which one." But Sarah could see something in his eyes that looked like approval. That night, Johnson came to her bunk and simply said, "Thank you." It was the beginning of a friendship that would last their entire military careers. As training progressed, Sarah's natural leadership abilities became impossible to ignore. Other recruits began coming to her with problems, both personal and professional. She helped them understand complex procedures, mediated disputes, and somehow managed to keep morale high even during the most difficult days. The drill sergeants noticed that groups Sarah was part of consistently performed better than others. During the final week of basic training, each recruit had to complete a solo navigation course through unfamiliar terrain. They were given a map, a compass, and 12 hours to reach a series of checkpoints scattered across 20 miles of rough country. Sarah completed the course in 8 hours, but instead of heading to the finish line, she used the remaining time to help locate 2 recruits who had gotten lost in the dense forest. When the training company graduated, Sarah finished second in her class overall and first in leadership evaluations. More importantly, she had earned the respect of her peers and instructors. During the graduation ceremony, as family members pinned new rank insignia on their soldiers, Sarah's grandfather stood proudly beside her parents. At 85 years old, he had made the long trip from Texas just to see his granddaughter become a soldier. After basic training, Sarah was assigned to advanced individual training for military intelligence. The coursework was intense, requiring her to learn multiple languages, understand complex analytical procedures, and master various communication technologies. She excelled in every area, but what set her apart was her ability to see patterns that others missed and make connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. Her instructors at the Intelligence School were impressed by her analytical mind, but they were even more impressed by her leadership potential. Sarah had a rare combination of intellectual ability and emotional intelligence that made her effective both as an analyst and as a leader. She could break down complex situations into understandable parts, but she also knew how to motivate and inspire the people around her. During a field exercise simulating real intelligence operations, Sarah's team was tasked with gathering information about enemy movements in a mock urban environment. While other teams focused on technological solutions, Sarah realized that the most valuable intelligence would come from building relationships with the local population. She spent hours talking with role players representing civilians, learning about their concerns and gaining their trust. Her approach paid off when a civilian provided her team with crucial information about enemy positions that had been hidden from satellite surveillance. The exercise controllers later said that Sarah's team had gathered more actionable intelligence in 3 days than some teams managed in 2 weeks. It was becoming clear that this young soldier had instincts that couldn't be taught in any classroom. As Sarah prepared for her first real assignment, she had no way of knowing that her path would soon cross with Commander Rebecca Steele, a decorated officer whose own career had been marked by courage under fire and innovative thinking. Their partnership would begin in the deserts of Afghanistan, where Sarah's quick thinking and Steele's experience would create one of the most effective military teams of their generation. The plane that would take Sarah to her first combat deployment was scheduled to leave in 6 hours. As she packed her gear, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a small town in Texas to the front lines of America's global military operations, she had grown from an idealistic young woman into a confident soldier, ready to serve her country wherever that service might lead her. The transport plane touched down at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Sarah Martinez stepped off the aircraft with her unit, immediately hit by the dry heat and the smell of dust that seemed to coat everything in this place. The landscape was unlike anything she had ever seen, harsh and beautiful at the same time, with mountains that stretched endlessly in every direction. Sarah's first assignment was to a forward operating base called Camp Phoenix, located in a strategically important valley about 60 miles from Kabul. The base housed approximately 800 soldiers and served as a hub for intelligence operations in the region. The living conditions were basic but functional, with sleeping quarters made from converted shipping containers and a dining facility that served meals around the clock to accommodate different mission schedules. Within her first week, Sarah met Commander Rebecca Steele, the officer who would change the trajectory of her entire military career. Steele was a 38-year-old career soldier who had earned her reputation through 15 years of exceptional service. She was known throughout the intelligence community for her ability to see the bigger picture while never losing sight of the human cost of military operations. Her soldiers respected her because she never asked them to do anything she wouldn't do herself. Steele had grown up in a military family and understood the weight of command in ways that textbooks could never teach. She had served in Iraq during the early years of that conflict, where she learned that the difference between success and failure often came down to split-second decisions made under extreme pressure. Her approach to leadership was hands-on, and she made it a point to know every soldier under her command personally. When Steele first reviewed Sarah's file, she was intrigued by the young soldier's combination of academic excellence and practical leadership skills. During their initial meeting, Steele asked Sarah a series of questions that seemed unrelated to intelligence work. She wanted to know about Sarah's family, her motivations for joining the Army, and her long-term career goals. Steele had learned that understanding a soldier's personal drivers was just as important as understanding their technical skills. Sarah's first major assignment involved analyzing communication intercepts to identify patterns that might reveal insurgent activity in the surrounding area. The work required her to spend long hours in a windowless room filled with computers and communication equipment, but Sarah found the analytical challenge engaging. She had always enjoyed puzzles, and this was like solving puzzles where the stakes were human lives. After 2 weeks of routine analytical work, Sarah made a discovery that caught everyone's attention. While reviewing seemingly routine radio traffic, she noticed that certain phrases were being used more frequently in specific geographic areas. Other analysts had dismissed these communications as normal civilian traffic, but Sarah's pattern recognition skills told her something different was happening. She spent 3 sleepless nights mapping the communication patterns against recent security incidents in the region. What she found was alarming. The unusual radio traffic consistently preceded attacks on coalition forces by approximately 48 hours. Sarah had uncovered a previously unknown insurgent communication network that was coordinating attacks across multiple provinces. When Sarah presented her findings to Commander Steele, the older officer was impressed not just by the discovery itself, but by the methodical approach Sarah had taken to verify her theory. Steele had seen too many young analysts jump to conclusions based on incomplete information, but Sarah had been thorough and careful in her analysis. This was exactly the kind of thinking that kept soldiers alive in combat zones. Steele decided to test Sarah's theory by having surveillance teams monitor the areas where the suspicious communications were most concentrated. Within 72 hours, they intercepted an insurgent cell attempting to plant improvised explosive devices along a route frequently used by coalition supply convoys. The information provided by Sarah's analysis allowed the coalition forces to neutralize the threat without any friendly casualties. Word of Sarah's breakthrough quickly spread through the intelligence community in Afghanistan. Senior officers began requesting briefings on her analytical methods, and she found herself explaining her approach to generals and colonels who had decades more experience than she did. But rather than being intimidated by the attention, Sarah used these opportunities to learn from the senior leaders and refine her own understanding of how intelligence operations worked. Commander Steele recognized that Sarah had abilities that went beyond routine analytical work. She began including Sarah in planning sessions for active operations, where Sarah's fresh perspective often provided valuable insights that more experienced officers had missed. Steele also made sure that Sarah understood the operational side of intelligence work, not just the analytical side. During one particularly complex operation, Sarah suggested a completely unconventional approach to gathering intelligence on a high-value target. Instead of relying on electronic surveillance or human intelligence assets, she proposed using social media analysis combined with economic data to predict where the target was most likely to appear. Her idea seemed far-fetched to some of the senior staff, but Steele decided to give it a try. Sarah's unconventional approach worked perfectly. By analyzing the target's social network and understanding his economic interests, she was able to predict his location with remarkable accuracy. The operation was a complete success, and several other high-value targets were captured as a result of the intelligence gathered during the mission. As word of these successes spread, Sarah began receiving offers from other units who wanted her analytical skills for their operations. But Commander Steele was reluctant to let Sarah go. She had come to rely on the young soldier's insights and, more importantly, she had begun to see Sarah as a protege who could eventually become an exceptional leader herself. The relationship between Steele and Martinez was developing into something more than a typical officer-enlisted soldier dynamic. Steele became a mentor to Sarah, sharing not just technical knowledge but also the hard-learned lessons of military leadership. Sarah, in turn, brought fresh energy and innovative thinking that helped Steele see familiar problems from new angles. During quiet moments between missions, Steele would share stories from her previous deployments, helping Sarah understand the broader context of their work in Afghanistan. She explained how military operations in this region were part of a complex web of political, economic, and cultural factors that had been developing for decades. Sarah absorbed these lessons eagerly, understanding that successful military leaders needed to think beyond purely tactical considerations. One evening, as they reviewed intelligence reports in Steele's office, the commander looked at Sarah seriously and said, "You have something special, Martinez. The question is what you're going to do with it." Sarah wasn't sure exactly what Steele meant, but she sensed that her military career was about to take a significant turn. She was right. Within weeks, events would unfold that would test both women in ways neither of them could have imagined, and their partnership would become legendary throughout the military community. The morning of March 15th started like any other day at Camp Phoenix. Sarah Martinez was reviewing overnight intelligence reports when Commander Steele burst into the operations center with an urgency that immediately grabbed everyone's attention. Intelligence had just received credible information about a planned attack on a coalition convoy traveling through the Tangi Valley. one of the most dangerous corridors in Afghanistan. The convoy was carrying essential supplies to a remote outpost that had been cut off for nearly a week due to bad weather and insurgent activity. Without these supplies, the soldiers at the outpost would be forced to abandon their position, which would create a significant gap in the coalition's defensive network. The mission was critical, but the intelligence indicated that insurgents had planned a complex ambush that would likely destroy the entire convoy. Steele gathered her team for an emergency briefing. The intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Insurgents had positioned themselves in the hills overlooking the main road, with backup forces ready to block any escape routes. They had also planted improvised explosive devices along the convoy's planned route. It was a sophisticated trap that had been weeks in the making. Sarah studied the terrain maps and communication intercepts, while Steele coordinated with higher headquarters about potential alternative routes. But every alternative path would add days to the journey, and the remote outpost didn't have days' worth of supplies remaining. The convoy would have to go through the Tangi Valley, which meant finding a way to neutralize the ambush before it could be executed. Steele made a decision that surprised everyone in the briefing room. Instead of requesting air support or additional ground forces, which would take hours to coordinate, she proposed a small reconnaissance team that could infiltrate the area and provide real-time intelligence to guide the convoy through safely. It was a high-risk approach, but it was the only option that could be implemented quickly enough to matter. The reconnaissance mission would require a team of only 4 soldiers who could move quickly and quietly through hostile territory. They would need to identify insurgent positions, locate the improvised explosive devices, and establish communication with the convoy to guide them through the safest route. Steele volunteered to lead the mission herself, which was typical of her hands-on leadership style. When Steele announced that she would be leading the reconnaissance team, Sarah immediately volunteered to go with her. Steele hesitated for a moment, knowing that Sarah's analytical skills might be more valuable back at the operations center. But something in Sarah's expression convinced her that the young soldier was ready for this kind of field operation. The team departed Camp Phoenix before dawn, using a route that would take them into the hills above the Tangi Valley under cover of darkness. In addition to Steele and Sarah, the team included Sergeant First Class Johnson, the same soldier Sarah had helped during basic training, and Corporal Williams, a communications specialist with extensive field experience. The insertion went smoothly, and by sunrise the team had established an observation position that gave them a clear view of the valley below. Through their scopes and binoculars, they could see insurgent fighters moving into position exactly where the intelligence reports had predicted they would be. Sarah counted at least 15 enemy combatants, but she suspected there were more hidden in the rocky terrain. Using hand signals to maintain silence, Steele positioned her team to observe different sections of the ambush site. Sarah was responsible for monitoring the eastern approach, where the convoy would first enter the valley. From her position, she could see 2 insurgents burying something in the road, which she immediately recognized as an improvised explosive device. The convoy was still 2 hours away when Sarah spotted something that changed everything. Through her binoculars, she saw a group of insurgents setting up what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher in a position that the intelligence reports hadn't identified. This weapon could destroy the lead vehicle in the convoy before they even reached the main ambush site. Sarah faced a critical decision. Standard procedure would be to report this new information through the chain of command and wait for instructions. But she calculated that by the time this information reached the convoy and they could change their approach, it would be too late. The convoy was already committed to the route, and stopping them now would leave them exposed in open terrain. Instead, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. She signaled to Commander Steele that she was moving to a better observation position, but instead of just observing, she planned to neutralize the rocket-propelled grenade threat herself. She knew that Steele would never approve such a risky plan, so Sarah couldn't ask for permission. Moving carefully through the rocky terrain, Sarah worked her way around to a position where she could approach the rocket-propelled grenade team from behind. The 2 insurgents were focused on preparing their weapon and watching the road below, which gave Sarah the element of surprise she needed. She had never engaged enemy combatants in close-quarters combat before, but her training had prepared her for this moment. Sarah's approach was perfect. She neutralized both insurgents quickly and quietly, preventing them from alerting the rest of the ambush force. But as she was securing the rocket-propelled grenade launcher, she realized that her position was now exposed to other insurgent fighters in the area. She was trapped on a rocky ledge with limited cover and no easy escape route. From her radio, Sarah could hear the convoy approaching the valley entrance. In 15 minutes, they would drive directly into the main ambush site, where the remaining insurgents were waiting. Sarah had successfully eliminated one threat, but there were still multiple insurgent positions that could destroy the convoy. Sarah made another split-second decision. Using the captured rocket-propelled grenade launcher, she began engaging the other insurgent positions from her elevated vantage point. Her first shot was perfectly placed, destroying a heavy machine gun position that would have been devastating to the convoy. But her attack also revealed her location to every insurgent in the valley. Suddenly, Sarah found herself under intense enemy fire from multiple directions. Bullets were hitting the rocks around her, and she could hear voices shouting in languages she didn't understand as insurgents coordinated their response to her attack. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a position with limited ammunition and no backup. From the main observation post, Commander Steele watched in horror as she realized what Sarah had done. Through her scope, she could see muzzle flashes from multiple insurgent positions all focused on Sarah's location. Steele immediately began coordinating with the other team members to create a diversion that might allow Sarah to escape. But they were too far away to provide immediate assistance. The convoy was now only 5 minutes from the main ambush site, and Sarah was running out of options. She had managed to eliminate several insurgent positions, but there were still enough enemy fighters left to destroy the convoy. Worse, her own position was becoming increasingly untenable as insurgents moved to surround her location. Commander Steele watched through her scope as insurgent fighters closed in on Sarah's position from 3 different directions. The young soldier was trapped on a rocky ledge with nowhere to run, and enemy fire was becoming more accurate with each passing minute. Steele had to make an impossible choice: maintain her team's hidden observation position to guide the approaching convoy, or abandon the mission to help Sarah. Without hesitation, Steele made the decision that would define her as a leader. She ordered Johnson and Williams to maintain their positions and continue monitoring the convoy's approach, while she moved to assist Sarah. It was a violation of standard tactical doctrine, but Steele couldn't leave one of her soldiers to face overwhelming odds alone. Steele began moving through the rocky terrain toward Sarah's position, using every piece of cover available to avoid detection by the insurgent forces. The distance between them was nearly 400 meters of dangerous ground, and Steele would have to cross several open areas where she would be exposed to enemy fire. But she had made her decision, and nothing would stop her from reaching Sarah. Meanwhile, Sarah was fighting for her life on the exposed ledge. She had used most of her ammunition for the captured rocket-propelled grenade launcher, and her personal weapon was running low on rounds. The insurgents had figured out her location and were coordinating a final assault to overwhelm her position. Sarah could hear their voices getting closer as they moved through the rocks below her. The convoy was now only 2 minutes from entering the kill zone where the main ambush waited. Sarah realized that even if she survived the next few minutes, the mission would still fail if she couldn't find a way to warn the convoy about the remaining insurgent positions. She tried to raise Johnson and Williams on the radio, but the rocky terrain was interfering with communications. Sarah made a desperate decision. Using her last rocket-propelled grenade, she aimed not at the insurgents closing in on her position, but at a large boulder balanced precariously on the hillside above the main ambush site. The explosion caused a massive rock slide that buried several insurgent positions and blocked the road where the convoy would have driven into the trap. The rock slide accomplished 2 things. It eliminated several more insurgent positions, and it forced the convoy to stop and reassess the situation. The convoy commander, seeing the blocked road and hearing the sounds of combat in the hills above, immediately called for backup and began looking for alternative routes through the valley. But Sarah's brilliant tactical move also sealed her own fate. The rocket-propelled grenade's backblast had revealed her exact position to the remaining insurgents, and they immediately concentrated all their fire on her location. Sarah found herself pinned down behind a small rock formation that provided minimal cover from the intense enemy fire. Commander. Steele was still 200 meters away when she saw the muzzle flashes concentrated on Sarah's position, She could tell from the volume of fire that Sarah was in immediate danger of being overrun. Steele had two choices: continue her careful approach and hope to arrive in time, or abandon stealth and make a direct assault on the insurgent positions. Steele chose the direct approach. Rising from her concealed position, she began moving rapidly toward the insurgent fighters, firing accurately with her rifle as she advanced. Her sudden appearance from an unexpected direction caught the insurgents completely off guard, and several of them turned their attention from Sarah to deal with this new threat. Steele's assault created the diversion Sarah needed to change her position. She moved quickly along the ledge to a slightly better defensive position, but she was still trapped and running dangerously low on ammunition. The insurgents were now caught between Steele's advancing position and Sarah's elevated firing point, but they still outnumbered the two Americans significantly. The firefight that followed would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Steele continued her aggressive advance, using fire and movement tactics that kept the insurgents from organizing an effective defense. Sarah provided covering fire from her elevated position, picking off insurgents who tried to flank Steele's advance. The two women worked together as if they had been partners for years, anticipating each other's movements and coordinating their actions without verbal communication. During the most intense part of the firefight, Steele's luck ran out. An insurgent fighter with a rifle had found a position where he could engage Steele from her flank, and his shot struck her in the shoulder, spinning her around and dropping her behind a low rock wall. Sarah saw Steele go down and immediately shifted her fire to suppress the insurgent who had shot her commander. Sarah faced another impossible decision. Steele was wounded and pinned down in an exposed position about 50 meters away. The insurgents were regrouping for a final assault that would likely overwhelm both American positions. The convoy was still blocked by the rock slide, but they were now calling in air support that wouldn't arrive for at least 20 minutes. Without hesitation, Sarah abandoned her defensive position and began moving toward Steele. She had no plan beyond reaching her wounded commander, but she knew she couldn't leave Steele to face the insurgents alone. Sarah's movement down the rocky slope was incredibly dangerous, as it exposed her to fire from multiple directions. Sarah reached Steele's position just as the insurgents began their final assault. Steele was conscious but losing blood from her shoulder wound, and her rifle had been damaged when she fell. Sarah quickly assessed the situation and realized they were about to be overrun by at least 8 insurgent fighters who were advancing with overwhelming firepower. In that moment, Sarah made a decision that would earn her a place in military history. Instead of trying to defend their position, she grabbed Steele and began pulling her toward a narrow crevice in the rocks that might provide better cover. Steele protested, knowing that Sarah was exposing herself to enormous danger, but Sarah was determined to get both of them to safety. The move to the crevice required Sarah to carry Steele across 30 meters of open ground while under intense enemy fire. Bullets were hitting the rocks around them, and Sarah could hear the insurgents shouting as they closed in for the final assault. But Sarah's determination and physical strength, developed through years of military training, allowed her to reach the crevice with Steele still alive. The narrow crevice provided excellent protection from direct fire, but it also trapped both women in a position with no escape route. Sarah had bought them time, but the insurgents would eventually find a way to attack their position from above or wait them out until their ammunition ran out. The situation seemed hopeless, but Sarah refused to give up. From their position in the crevice, Sarah could see that the convoy had finally managed to find an alternative route around the rockslide. The mission was succeeding, but at what might be the cost of both their lives. Air support was still 15 minutes away, and Sarah wasn't sure they could hold their position that long against the determined insurgent assault that was surely coming. Inside the narrow rock crevice, Commander Steele was struggling to stay conscious while Sarah worked frantically to stop the bleeding from her shoulder wound. Sarah had learned basic medical training during her military education, but treating a gunshot wound under combat conditions while surrounded by hostile forces was far beyond anything she had practiced in training. Exercises. Sarah used her own field dressing to create a pressure bandage for Steele's wound, knowing that she was now left with no medical supplies for herself if she got injured. Steele tried to protest, insisting that Sarah should save her medical supplies, but Sarah ignored her commander's objections. She had made the decision to save Steele's life, and she would use whatever resources were necessary to accomplish that goal. The insurgents had temporarily pulled back from their assault, but Sarah could hear them moving through the rocks above and around their position. They were clearly planning a coordinated attack that would come from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah counted her remaining ammunition and realized she had enough rounds for maybe 3 minutes of sustained combat, assuming every shot hit its target. Steele, despite her wound and blood loss, was still thinking tactically about their situation. She pointed out to Sarah that the insurgents' biggest advantage was their numbers, but their biggest weakness was that they didn't know exactly where the two Americans were positioned within the crevice. If Sarah could use that uncertainty to her advantage, she might be able to hold them off until air support arrived. Sarah studied the terrain around their position and developed a plan that was both brilliant and incredibly dangerous. The crevice they were hiding in had several narrow openings that led to different parts of the rocky formation. Sarah could move between these openings, making it appear that there were multiple defenders in different positions, which might convince the insurgents that they were facing a larger force than they actually were. The plan required Sarah to leave Steele alone and defenseless for extended periods while she moved between firing positions. Steele objected strongly, arguing that Sarah should stay in one defensive position rather than risk getting cut off or surrounded while moving through the rocks. But Sarah had made up her mind, and she had learned from Steele herself that sometimes leadership required making difficult decisions quickly. Sarah began implementing her plan just as the insurgents started their coordinated assault. She fired several shots from the main crevice entrance, then quickly moved through the narrow rock passages to a secondary position, where she fired from a completely different angle. The insurgents, hearing gunfire from multiple locations, began spreading their own forces to deal with what they thought were several different defensive positions. The deception worked better than Sarah had hoped. The insurgents were now attacking positions where no Americans were actually located, while Sarah moved between her various firing points like a ghost in the rocks. She was using her limited ammunition very carefully, taking only high-probability shots and constantly changing position to maintain the illusion of multiple defenders. But Sarah's plan also had a significant weakness. The constant movement through narrow rock passages was exhausting, and she was slowly losing track of where all the insurgent fighters were positioned. During one move between positions, she found herself face to face with an insurgent who had been trying to flank what he thought was her main position. The close quarters encounter lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours to Sarah. Both fighters were surprised by the sudden contact, but Sarah's training gave her the advantage she needed. She neutralized the insurgent threat, but the encounter had cost her precious time and ammunition. More importantly, it revealed to the other insurgents that they were actually facing only one or two defenders. With their true numbers now known, the insurgents quickly regrouped and began a more organized assault on the crevice. Sarah rushed back to Steele's position, knowing that her deception had been discovered and that the final battle was about to begin. Steele was weaker from blood loss but still alert, and she had managed to get her sidearm ready for the coming fight. The two women prepared to make their last stand in the narrow crevice that had become both their salvation and their potential tomb. Sarah had only a few rounds left for her rifle, and Steele's shoulder wound meant she could barely hold her pistol steady. They could hear the insurgents coordinating their final assault, and both women knew that their chances of survival were minimal. Just when the situation seemed hopeless, they heard a sound that was more beautiful than any music either of them had ever experienced. The distinctive whine of jet engines approaching at high speed. The air support that had been promised was finally arriving, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. Sarah grabbed her radio and began trying to establish contact with the incoming aircraft. She needed to provide them with precise coordinates for the insurgent positions, while making sure they didn't accidentally target her own location. The radio communication was difficult because of the rocky terrain and the stress of the situation. But Sarah managed to guide the pilots to the correct area. The airstrike that followed was swift and decisive. The insurgent positions were eliminated with surgical precision, and the immediate threat to Sarah and Steele was neutralized. But both women remained in their defensive positions for several minutes after the explosion stopped, hardly able to believe that they had actually survived the ordeal. When rescue helicopters finally arrived to evacuate them from the valley, Sarah helped load the wounded Steele onto a stretcher while refusing medical attention for herself. She had sustained several minor injuries during the firefight, including cuts from moving through the sharp rocks and bruises from the intense combat. but she insisted that other wounded soldiers should receive priority treatment. The convoy that Sarah and Steele had protected reached its destination safely, delivering critical supplies to the remote outpost that had been cut off for over a week. The mission was considered a complete success, but the cost had been high. Several other soldiers had been wounded in related actions throughout the day, and the intelligence network that Sarah had helped uncover had been significantly disrupted by the insurgent losses. During the helicopter flight back to Camp Phoenix, Steele looked at Sarah with an expression of profound respect and gratitude. "You saved my life today," she said simply. Sarah started to protest that they had saved each other, but Steele continued. "More than that, you showed leadership under impossible conditions. You're going to go far in this army, Martinez." Sarah had no way of knowing that Steele's words would prove prophetic, or that the events in the Tangi Valley would become a turning point, not just in her own career, but in military history. The partnership between the two women had been tested under the most extreme conditions possible, and it had emerged stronger than ever. But their greatest challenges and most significant achievements still lay ahead. The news of what happened in the Tangi Valley spread through the military community faster than either Sarah Martinez or Rebecca Steele could have imagined. Within 48 hours of their return to Camp Phoenix, senior officers from multiple command levels were requesting detailed briefings about the operation. The combination of Sarah's innovative intelligence analysis, her life-saving actions under fire, and Steele's mentorship had created a partnership that military leaders recognized as something extraordinary. General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer for intelligence operations in Afghanistan, personally flew to Camp Phoenix to debrief both women about their actions during the convoy protection mission. General Hayes was known throughout the military as a tough, no-nonsense leader who had broken numerous barriers during her own rise through the ranks. She had specifically requested this meeting because she saw in Sarah and Steele something that the military desperately needed: proof that innovative thinking and courageous leadership could overcome seemingly impossible odds. During the debriefing, General Hayes was particularly interested in how Sarah had developed her pattern recognition skills and applied them to real-world intelligence challenges. Sarah explained her analytical methods in detail, but what impressed the general most was Sarah's ability to think beyond conventional approaches and take decisive action when lives were at stake. Steele added her own observations about Sarah's natural leadership, abilities, and her potential for future command positions. The formal recognition for their actions came in the form of military decorations, but more importantly, both women were offered opportunities that would reshape their careers. Steele was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given command of a larger intelligence unit that would coordinate operations across multiple provinces. Sarah was offered immediate promotion to sergeant and acceptance into an accelerated leadership development program that typically required years of additional service to qualify for. But the most significant opportunity came when General Hayes proposed creating an entirely new type of military unit based on the success of the Steele-Martinez partnership. The concept was revolutionary: small, highly trained teams that combined advanced intelligence analysis with direct action capabilities. These units would be able to identify threats, develop solutions, and implement those solutions without waiting for approval from multiple levels of command. The program was initially met with skepticism from traditional military leaders who questioned whether such unconventional units could be effective on a larger scale. Critics argued that the success in the Tangi Valley was an isolated incident that couldn't be replicated consistently. But General Hayes had seen enough evidence to convince her that this approach represented the future of military operations. In complex environments like Afghanistan, Steele and Sarah were chosen to develop the training protocols and operational procedures for these new units. The assignment took them away from Afghanistan and back to the United States, where they would spend the next year working with military researchers, training specialists, and technology experts to create something that had never existed before in military history. The development process was challenging in ways that neither woman had anticipated. They had to translate their instinctive battlefield partnership into systematic training methods that could be taught to other soldiers. This required them to analyze every decision they had made during the Tangi Valley operation and understand why their collaboration had been so effective under extreme pressure. Sarah discovered that her pattern recognition abilities could be enhanced through specific types of training and practice. Working with cognitive scientists, she developed exercises that helped other soldiers learn to see connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. More importantly, she learned how to teach these skills to others, which revealed yet another dimension of her leadership capabilities. Steele focused on the command and control aspects of the new unit concept. She had to figure out how to maintain military discipline and coordination, while giving individual soldiers the authority to make independent decisions in rapidly changing situations. This balance between centralized command and decentralized execution was critical to the success of the entire program. The first pilot units were trained, using the protocols that Steele and Sarah developed together. The soldiers selected for this program were exceptional individuals who had demonstrated both analytical skills and combat effectiveness in previous deployments. But even these outstanding soldiers struggled initially with the demanding requirements of the new approach. The training was unlike anything the military had ever attempted. Soldiers had to master advanced analytical techniques, learn to operate sophisticated intelligence-gathering equipment, and maintain the physical fitness and combat skills necessary for direct action missions. More challenging than the technical requirements was learning to think independently while still functioning as part of a coordinated team. Sarah and Steele rotated between instructor roles, with Sarah focusing on intelligence analysis and pattern recognition, while Steele concentrated on tactical operations and leadership development. But their most valuable contribution was demonstrating how effective partnerships could be formed between soldiers with different skill sets and backgrounds. The first operational deployment of the new units took place 18 months after the Tangi Valley incident. 3 teams were sent to different regions of Afghanistan to test the concepts that Steele and Sarah had developed. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. The new units identified and neutralized threats that conventional forces had been unable to address for months. One unit discovered and dismantled an insurgent financing network that had been operating undetected for over 2 years. Another team identified and captured a high-value target who had evaded conventional forces by constantly changing his location and communication methods. The third unit prevented a major attack on coalition forces by identifying and interdicting the insurgent planning process before the attack could be executed. The success of these operations validated everything that Steele and Sarah had argued about the effectiveness of their approach, but more importantly, it demonstrated that their partnership in the Tangi Valley had not been a fortunate accident. It had been the result of specific skills and approaches that could be taught to other soldiers and replicated in different situations. Recognition of their achievements came from the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Both women received promotions and were invited to brief members of Congress and senior administration officials about their innovations. Military academies began incorporating their methods into their curricula, and foreign militaries requested training on the techniques they had developed. Sarah's analytical methods became standard procedure in intelligence units throughout the military. Her approach to pattern recognition and threat assessment was adopted by agencies beyond the military, including law enforcement and homeland security organizations. What had started as an intuitive ability to see connections others missed had evolved into a systematic methodology that enhanced national security capabilities. Steele's leadership philosophy also had a lasting impact on military culture. Her emphasis on mentorship, her willingness to take calculated risks, and her ability to recognize and develop talent in others became a model for officer development programs. The principles she demonstrated in her partnership with Sarah were studied and taught as examples of effective military leadership. But perhaps their most important legacy was proving that innovation and tradition could work together in military organizations. They had shown that respecting military discipline and chain of command was compatible with encouraging independent thinking and creative problem-solving. Their example inspired a generation of military leaders to seek new solutions to complex challenges while maintaining the values and standards that made military organizations effective. Years later, when military historians analyzed the changes that occurred in military operations during the early 21st century, the Steele-Martinez partnership was consistently identified as a turning point. Their actions in the Tangi Valley had saved lives in the immediate term, but their longer-term impact on military doctrine and training had influenced thousands of soldiers, and contributed to successful operations around the world. Sarah Martinez had begun her military career as an idealistic, young woman from a small Texas town who wanted to serve her country. Through her partnership with Rebecca Steele, she had become a pioneering figure whose innovations changed how military organizations approached some of their most challenging problems. Her journey from small-town recruit to military innovator demonstrated that extraordinary achievements could emerge from the combination of natural talent, excellent training, and the courage to act when action was required. The story of how she pulled her commander from the line of fire and then made a legendary mark on military history became an inspiration for future generations of soldiers, proving that individual initiative and effective partnerships could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles and create lasting positive change.